we have something that is a creation in the works that is going to be described, and we were invited to consider and perhaps get involved with. Bob Parke is a member of the board of the Behaviour Institute, and he is a bioethicist. He worked and has since retired from the Humber River Regional Hospital, but is currently still working with Surrey Place, a special facility program in Toronto, which focuses on, I believe, both adults and children with intellectual disabilities. And this has merged with the desire to see good palliative care being provided for those for whom it hasn't been. So Bob Parke, we invite you to speak about improving palliative care for people with intellectual disorders. Thank you very much, Bob.
Good evening, and thank you for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak with you. And I'm going to speak about a population that Dr. Pritchard just spoke about, who are quite vulnerable, those with intellectual disorders. And I'm hoping that my slides will advance as I'm hoping that I want them to. And so far, so good. I'm just digesting somewhat of what Dr. Pritchard had said, so I may have some thoughts or questions a little bit later, but I highly, highly value the work that you've been doing, Dr. Pritchard. Thank you for that. Because I've always been mindful in our healthcare practices that we have to watch out for those who have special needs, those who are vulnerable. What I want to do this evening is share with you a little bit about some work that we've begun doing in regards to improving the care for people who have intellectual disabilities. And I want to start with sharing with you some documents and some work that I had done through when I was appointed to the Ontario Palliative Care Network, which was a real privilege for me. And I was appointed to the Clinical Advisory Committee. And there are a few things that we did on that committee, and one of which I was on the Education Committee. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see Ontario Palliative Care Competency Framework. It was published April 2019. And we did some good foundational work in terms of identifying what are the competencies for people for whom palliative care is their practice and for whom palliative care is part of their practice. And those competencies range everybody from physicians to volunteers to chaplains, social workers, paramedics, PSWs, etc. There was something written there in terms of addressing palliative care competency. Certainly our goal was to try to improve palliative care for the province of Ontario. And I think we heard it earlier, by the way. I think Zoe, you mentioned it. There was some discussion about how, there's richness in palliative care in some parts of Ontario, and there's very few resources in other parts of the province. And it's not always about being rural. Some rural parts of the province may have good palliative care, and some parts of even our own city don't have the same support. Now, what was striking to myself and a colleague, her name is Tracy Human, and Tracy Human is, she's a nurse, and she does work that goes out, palliative care consultations, and goes out into the community, particularly into long-term care homes and into group homes. But what struck us in our work is nothing was said about people with disabilities, and in particular those with intellectual disabilities. And it was interesting, it was almost the silence in the documents that was actually what hit me more than what was said. And therefore we thought we ought to do something. We ought to work on a response. One of the things I wanted to draw our attention to is that perhaps we may think that the population of people with intellectual disabilities is relatively small, but one, they all need healthcare. And two, most of us who work in hospital settings have group homes or congregate living settings near our places of work, or they have long-term care homes near our places of work, and long-term care homes also accommodate people with intellectual disabilities. And there's a picture here that of Participation House, if you remember, during the first wave of COVID, had some problems with staff and residents getting COVID, and they're almost across the street from Markham Stillwell Hospital. But certainly we will have our people who come into our hospitals needing care. Now, we've done some very early work, and I would say we've had 3 meetings, and we brought people together who are situated in resources like RENA, like New Visions, like the Salvation Army Homes, Christian Horizons, who care for people in their settings, and also Toronto Community Living. And so these people have come together because we shared, and it was actually wonderful how easy it was to bring people together, because most of our colleagues and friends in this group recognized that there is a problem, that there is a gap in terms of our knowledge about palliative care for people with intellectual disabilities. One of the things that we would certainly like to do, and with Ontario Palliative Care Network, is we're reaching out to them. We're going to be having a meeting in December to see if we can use their ability to bring people from throughout the province into our work. Because right now our work is largely Greater Toronto area, and we need to expand into the province. Now, there were some themes or gaps that we identified in our early work that I wanted to share with you. One of those, I would say the major theme that was identified in our work, which is different than the general population in terms of the provision of palliative care services, is the need to bridge communications barriers. On the upper left, you can see a facsimile of something which we may call a pocket talker, and how many times we all have worked with people and have maybe in our own families, people who are hard of hearing. And there is anecdotal experience many of us have, but there's also empirical evidence that when people don't hear well, of course, they don't answer well, and therefore we as healthcare professionals may conclude that they're incapable, and then we end up turning to their substitute decision maker to make treatment decisions for them, when all we needed to do was to identify that they had a hearing problem and find ways to bridge that. A few years ago, I was doing an assessment with an occupational therapist, and we used a pocket talker with somebody who was profoundly hard of hearing. And it was a wonderful feeling afterwards when that dear woman said to us, "Thank you for caring." And we were able to engage her, have her participating in her care, and she felt her dignity and worth was there. Certainly other ways of engaging people in communication is using tablets. I should have actually put an image of a cell phone. Story that I know from one of the speech language pathologists that I worked with was of a woman who lost her tongue due to cancer, and she couldn't speak anymore, but she texted with her daughter. And the wonderful thing about that texting as a communications tool was it was not stigmatizing. Years ago, we may have had to go to an augmentative communications clinic, maybe spend a lot of money to get augmentative communications devices, which might have been large and clunky. Now with our cell phones, how wonderful that is to ease communications. And a shout out to Zoe, because Zoe knows this work about deafblind interpretation. And Zoe reminded me a couple of weeks ago when we had a brief conversation that it's important to realize that although people are living with this challenge, they are not incapable. Their minds are as good as ours, and therefore we need to find ways to communicate with people who are deafblind. And of course, we have an image here of different kinds of tablets or other tools that we can use to help communicate with people who are nonverbal for whatever the reason that they can't communicate. I wanted to share a little story with you, and this expression about behavior translation comes from Tracy Human. I give her credit for these words. And her story that she shares was about a young man who had an intellectual disability, had cancer, was living in a group home, and he was seen standing by the lampshade, and he was, how do you say it? Run his hands through the tassels that you see on the lampshade, and people were wondering, what is he doing? Well, what was found out was that when he was in pain, he would take his hands and go through those tassels on the lampshade because he found that soothing. And when he was in pain, he felt he needed to be soothed, and this is the way that he did it. And when somebody identified what his behavior was, then they were able to provide him with the medications he needed to address his pain. And in this particular circumstance, the pain management he needed was Tylenol, and that was helpful to him. And when he had Tylenol, he was able to return back to his sort of normal behaviors, or behaviors that were normal to him in his environment. So the need for behavior translation, that's one of the things that we identified as being important, that healthcare providers in hospitals and other settings should be aware of. Now, one of the tools that was created at Surrey Place, and I'm so grateful for my colleagues there and Dr. Bill Sullivan and others, and there's a website up here, for people who have to leave their homes, group homes, homes who have an intellectual disability, this hospital transfer form provides information about how people communicate, what might trigger behaviors, um, who to call on to help them. And these can be used to help to smooth the transition if they have to come into the hospital and help in the triage setting. One of the things too that we've learned too from our work, and I've seen this myself from assessments I've done, is that many people living in group homes have been estranged from their families. And we had a fairly recent situation where the person was in a group home, but the family was called only in a time of crisis. And the difficulty was, of course, that the family didn't know their family member very well because they had been away from the family for some time. And oftentimes, the group home staff were more like family. Sometimes we call them fictive family. Another thing that we found in terms of decision making was that people with intellectual disabilities are often under the care of a guardian. You know, in Ontario, we have the public guardian and trustee, and one of physicians I know, this is something he said to me just recently when we were talking about this, and the public guardian and trustees don't know the person and they have to make decisions for them. And one of the challenges too for us as healthcare professionals is in Ontario, we have this hierarchy of decision makers, and the law says that we have to defer to them. We have to identify the STM and defer to them in terms of decision making, but they may not know the person anymore, may not know how to work well with them. And if you don't know how to work well with somebody who has an intellectual disability, it may create a negative response. The person who was admitted to the hospital that I mentioned, because of COVID, they weren't allowed their specialized worker with them. And when staff went to do diagnostics and assessments, it triggered bad behaviors. And those bad behaviors, of course, were something that prejudiced the future care that person was getting. You know, oh, this is a person with behavioral problems. However, thank goodness for some advocacy, and we were able to get the person who knew how best to work with that patient with intellectual disability to be able to have time in the hospital. Wanted to share with you another thing too in terms of decision making, that it is important that we look at how can we engage people in decision making, and there's some pretty serious and good work being done on the areas of supported decision making. And certainly in the Iris Institute in Toronto, it's worth looking at that if you're interested in supported decision making. There's some work done in Western Australia on supported decision maker, but I'd like you to take a look at some point in the future if you have time. But this first image on the left side here says, assume I can. And then I think that's the first thing that we have to do. Don't assume that simply because somebody has an intellectual disability that they can't participate in decision making. We may have to find different ways of getting the right people involved and in the right place, and explore different ways of communicating with them. A story I know from a person who had a physical and intellectual disability who lives in Ottawa. Finally, he got upset with people for making decisions for him. And one day he said, can I please choose the topping on my pizza? And so if he could say that, what more if we could work with him to find ways to engage him in treatment decisions that he would have to make. I just have a couple more slides and then we'll almost be finished. One of the other areas that we identified is in our early work is challenges related to illness trajectory. And one of those challenges as compared to the general population, you take somebody who has Down syndrome and who may experience dementia, and they may experience dementia before those of us who become seniors, and they may not be eligible for a geriatric assessment because they're not seniors. And people with Down syndrome may experience heart failure and other issues differently than the general population. So therefore, these are some things we have to look at. How can we help general practitioners, hospital staff to identify best practices in regards to people with intellectual disabilities? The other thing that we identified in terms of medications and medication usage was oftentimes, or too often, medications are being given in response to behaviors, not in response to symptoms. Lastly, the other area that we're working through and considering is how can we help provide care for people in their homes? This is one of the goals of the Ontario Palliative Care Network for the general population, is to try to avoid hospitalizations unless necessary, and sometimes they are. But with the population of people with intellectual disabilities, how can we help them stay in their homes, even if they are group homes, and die within those places and provide the best care possible? The other thing that we want to look at is how can we ensure that the resources and knowledge is there for people who work in palliative care settings, hospices, palliative care units, so that they would, if they are admitting somebody with an intellectual disability, they would know how best to care for them and give them a dignified and meaningful experience until their life comes to its natural conclusion. I hope I didn't go over too much, but I wanted to thank you for listening to my presentation. And I certainly welcome any of you to, my email contact is there. Any of you have interest in this work and want to see what we can do to improve care, I would welcome your emails and perhaps engaging with us at a future point. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Zoe and all.
Thank you very, very much, Bob Parke. This is a very exciting initiative, and you've touched on so many different ways in which we can all consider how communication can be better, and also how we continue to have so many opportunities to improve care for everyone. And this is just one way in which people are coming together to improve care for adults with intellectual disabilities. And it's inspiring.